Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to all the people in our audience all over the world. I am Doug Silliman, president of the Arab Gulf States Institute in Washington, and it is my great pleasure to welcome you to the keynote conversation of our 6th annual Petro Diplomacy conference. To help guide our discussions this week, AGSIW has just published on our website, which is www.agsiw.org, a paper outlining the themes of our conversations of the week. Coincidence of coronavirus and climate change accelerates major shifts in oil and gas industries, by Kate Durian, a non-resident fellow at AGSIW. Now, before I introduce today's guest for the conversation, I would like to introduce the ground rules for the conversation. This conversation will be on the record, it will be recorded, and will be available tomorrow on AGSIW's website. We encourage all of you who are listening to participate in the conversation by asking questions through the Q&A function at the bottom of your Zoom screen. Click on the icon and type in your question. I will track and consolidate the questions and pose them to our speaker. And we have an exceptional speaker with us today. Dr. Angela Wilkinson is the Secretary General and CEO of the World Energy Council. She is a leading energy expert in global energy futures, an experienced energy executive, a distinguished Oxford scholar, and a published author. She has worked with the OECD in Paris, Royal Dutch Shell, British Gas. She has a PhD in physics, with which I'm particularly impressed. Was an associate at the Side Business School at Oxford University and a strategic foresight fellow at the US Government Accountability Office. And I, even with 35 years in the US government, did not know we had anybody with foresight in the US government. She joined the World Energy Council in 2017, and you can read the rest of her impressive credentials and experience on our website. So Dr. Wilkinson, it's a pleasure to have you here with us today.
Thank you, Douglas. It's great to join this particular community.
Now, if I could get you to start our conversation by telling us all a little bit about the World Energy Council, what is your mission, and what do you do in the World Energy Council?
Oh, super. So the World Energy Council was founded in 1923, 97 years old. And we were formed at a time which was just after a global flu pandemic and just before the Great Depression. There seems to be some similes with the world today. 97 years later, we were formed with a mission, really better energy for everyone. And we still maintain that mission. And we are the world's energy community. We were formed as practical men in those days. These days we'd say practical men and women. The manufacturers, the financiers, the engineers, we are the how to build and transform energy systems community worldwide.
Well, I understand that you also have a number of tools for your members that help them with various parts of their industries. Can you explain a little bit about how the World Energy Council works with its members to help them deal with and solve their problems?
Yeah, so we have three roles really. Inspire people to think about a better energy future. What does that mean and how do you get there? Inform what's the current state of the energy system and what are the developments that we really need to be paying attention to? And impact, how do we do better than we've been doing in the past? And in this current crisis, we've been looking at an exchange of experiences across all of our members in nearly 100 countries. What have been the impacts of the crisis? What are the actions that they're taking? And what's the outlook for the industry as a whole? We've also been equipping them with, we have already an energy transition leaders toolkit. I won't go into detail, but the new tools we've been adding are COVID crisis scenarios to 2024. Energy leaders have to work out how do they manage through crisis and how do they recover? So we've been trying to give them the tools to help them do that. And at the Clean Energy Ministerial 2 weeks ago, I launched the World Energy Transition Radar, which is a world first. It detects signals from across the world and tells us which direction is the world energy system heading in.
Well, let's dive a little bit into the substance then. Can you lay out for us, as you see it and as the World Energy Council sees it, some of the biggest trends in global energy going forward? You've mentioned the coronavirus crisis going forward, but there must be other things that you and your members are dealing with. Can you lay those out for us, please?
Sure. I mean, no crisis happens in a vacuum. And we talk about an essential place to start in recovering from crisis is to understand the bigger picture. And we talk about what we call the 4 global drivers of change. These 4 Ds that are shaping all different forms of energy, oil and gas, nuclear, renewables, and energy uses everywhere, are decarbonisation, decentralisation, digitalisation, and what we now call disruption as usual. So if I start with decarbonisation, I think everybody understands that. Nobody wants a climate change crisis. And we know that energy use and production contribute the majority of greenhouse gas emissions. So we're trying to work out how can we use more energy and achieve climate neutrality. The digitalisation piece is we are seeing new opportunities for managing current energy activities by including the internet, by including data, by gathering digital signals from different parts of the system. That's happening everywhere. And the decentralisation is we used to live in a world where we had big centralised power stations and big production facilities. And now we have far more renewable and distributed types of energy activity. So that's the decentralisation. And then the disruption bit is we are seeing increasingly a shift from what we would call supply-centric thinking. We always used to worry about scarcity of supply. And now we're moving into a world where we see disruption as usual, and it's demand-driven disruption. It's how we're using energy that's changing the most, and that's changing how we produce and supply it.
You also, in your public talks, talk a lot about energy transition. And again, I'd like you to explain to us a bit what you mean when you say energy transition, what are the components of that, and how do you see it evolving in the near future in the context of concerns about climate change and the coronavirus crisis and the impacts of those on global energy markets?
Okay, so transition for us is a process, not a destination. There's often a confusion that transition is a single destination, right? We talk about the transition to something, whereas for us it's a long process. We've had transitions before in human history. Fire, that was a transition. Fusion, that was a transition. Fossil fuels, that was a transition. Now we're talking increasingly about an accelerating pace of electrification, and we're talking about this transition to what we would call clean, affordable, reliable energy for everyone, everywhere, and increasingly flexible and on-the-move energy, right? So the future of energy is more access to more energy with less, with a healthy planet outcome and a healthy society outcome. That's the future of energy. So transition is how do we get from here to there, right? And there are many different pathways, and regional energy systems are diverse. If you look in Latin America, they have far more hydroelectricity than they have in Europe. If you look in the Middle East, of course, they rely not just on energy for use, but also for their economy. And if you go to places like Europe, there are very, very different structures of national energy systems. You know, some countries are very diverse in their mixes, others are much more electrified, some are much more fossil-based. So transition requires us to think about where do we want to go? We want to go to a world today, post-COVID, where we have more energy for everybody and climate neutrality, but we have to grapple with this new context of affordability and social justice and recognise that we have disruption as usual, not stability as the normal. So we're transitioning through a new era of energy. And we talked about energy for peace in 1923. We were formed because people thought governments basically would not be able to sort out energy for everybody. We've moved through an era of what we might call energy for prosperity. And we've entered this era of energy for people, planet, and prosperity, which we call energy for humanity. And in 2022 in St. Petersburg, we will convene again as the World Energy Community in St. Petersburg under the theme of energy for humanity. So our transition is not just about carbon or climate, but it's also about helping humanity to reach for the stars, not just return to the sun.
But Thank you for that. And I was actually struck by something that you said a couple of weeks ago at the Clean Energy Ministerial, and I'll quote what you said, one part of it. If there is any hope of transforming the stressed global energy system after COVID, quote, it will involve massive financial capital reallocation in a new context of affordability and social justice. And my question when I read that sentence was really, how do you square the concept of massive financial reallocation with affordability? And how do you achieve social justice? What exactly do you mean by social justice? Is it simply universal access to reliable energy, or is it something deeper than that?
So I mentioned that, energy's never been a single issue agenda. There's a lot of single issue passions, but for us, we talk about the energy trilemma, that if you really want to manage transitions for the benefits of everyone everywhere, you've got to think about energy security, affordability and equity, and environmental sustainability. And coming out of the COVID crisis, there are some very clear signals. First of all, ambition remains high. Everybody's talking about the need for greater ambition, for more cooperation to achieve the possibility of transformational outcomes, right? How do we move faster? How do we help more energy, get more energy to people who don't have energy? How do we get carbon out of the system faster than we were doing before? How do we help bring on the new technologies and make improvements better than we were doing in the past? Transformation. But we're going to have to do that. Reality-wise, we've just had a lockdown of our economy. We're going to have to do that in a new context of affordability. People, at the end of the day, energy systems change because people pay for change, right? Some people say to me, who's going to pay for that? And I always say, at the end of the day, it's you and me. We pay for it. We're the customers, we're the consumers, we're the citizens. We pay. There's no magic bank. So you have to manage transition in a way which is socially affordable and which is fair to societies that are impacted by those transitions. Otherwise, it doesn't matter how much technology we've got, you can't push a transition against a society. You can only pull it with a society. So COVID gives us a new economic context. It doesn't give us a new technological context. It gives us a new social context and a new economic context through which to manage these transitions. That's what I mean.
If I might for just a minute, talk a little bit about the region that we at the Gulf States Institute cover most, and that's the hydrocarbons producing states of the Middle East, primarily in the Persian Gulf Basin. There is a lot of fear in the region. There's a lot that has been written about demand destruction after COVID and a trend toward peak oil demand in the relatively near future. And some have predicted an end to the oil era and a collapse of those economies that are based only on hydrocarbon resource extraction and export. So how do you see the trends in hydrocarbons, and how does that fit into your framework of affordable and socially just energy transition?
So even in the COVID crisis, right, we're still producing 80 million barrels of oil a day. We're still using an awful lot of oil. And when people talk about peak demand, what they mean is they won't see further growth in demand for oil. That's not the same as Everest as a profile. Demand goes up and then all of a sudden it comes down. It's much more around when do you hit the pinnacle of the mountain. After that, the question is, what does the curve look like? And we would say it's going to be slower and flatter for a lot longer than the way some other people talk about it. So peak demand is not the same as what goes up immediately comes down. What goes up can be sustained. 80 million barrels of oil a day at the moment. 70 million barrels during the COVID crisis. We've lost 10 million barrels a day, but we've also locked down all of our economies, right? We're not actually doing much economically. As we start to move, as we start to open our economies, we will see a return in demand for energy. I talk about what's called the demand tsunami, that actually the amount of energy that's going to be needed, particularly by the emerging economies, is vast and massive. And there's no way that those countries are going to wait until we have sorted out the scale up of a renewable energy system in order to meet their needs today. This brings us into the terrain of end of the week versus end of the world type thinking. So people are going to, the World Energy Council, we just say all technologies and innovation will be needed. That's the same message as the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. We need oil and gas, we need renewables, we need nuclear, we need them all to step forward. We need to bring solutions that are affordable to different societies that have different starting points. We need to make sure that they are as clean as possible, and there are many different routes for clean. If we want to get to as few degrees warming as possible, we need as many degrees of maneuverability as possible. So we should be thinking not clean as a colour green, but clean as it doesn't matter what colour it is, as long as it's got less carbon or it's carbon neutral. So that gives us many more degrees of freedom for using energy, to give more energy to more people, for more jobs, for more livelihoods, for more decent human lives, and at the same time to address the climate challenge, the affordability challenge, and the justice challenges alongside that.
Thank you for making that point. I find it very interesting. And last year at a conference I attended, the Kenyan Minister of Energy said that he felt he was under great pressure from the developed world and IOCs and politicians to develop energy in Kenya that was going to be green and had less pollution. He also said that's expensive energy. We in Kenya, without international help, can perhaps afford to build coal plants. We can't afford to build nuclear reactors. We cannot afford to put in small solar or wind farms across the country. How do you deal with the mismatch in resources across the world as the World Energy Council, as you look toward providing affordable and socially just energy in parts of the world that don't have the same resources as North America or Europe or developed Asia?
Well, we always say energy transition is going to require unprecedented innovation and unprecedented cooperation. We call this collaborative innovation, right? Putting two things together that didn't used to be put together. But we also say there's a difference between innovation and progress. And the difference for us is that you have to humanize energy. At the end of the day, it's about energy for societies, people, and communities. And all energy systems become cheaper through accelerating their innovation curves, right? You've got innovation curves in coal, you've got innovation curves in oil and gas, you've got innovation curves in renewables. Renewables are much smaller scale and they're much more decentralized. You have lots of micro innovation cycles going very, very quickly. I think what we have to do is you have to match that at scale. You've got to think about how does the coal sector produce an innovation response, which is scalable, right, in a different way to the innovation learning curve that's going on in renewables. And you have to take into account the full cost to societies if you do that. There's far too much focus or emphasis for me on what we call marginal cost. What does it cost to produce an additional unit of energy? As though that energy is going to be used wherever it's produced without any transport, without any storage, without any other costs. And that's just not real. So at the moment, we tend to think about affordability in terms of an additional cost to produce an additional unit of energy. What we have to think is what's the cost to use the energy, not the cost to produce the energy. And if we change the economics round and we think about what's affordability for the user, not what's the cost to the producer, I think we start looking at different innovation pathways, we look at different system transition pathways, we look at different solutions.
Riffing off of that, let me go back to the Middle East for just a moment. As I said, there is a wide variety of responses in the countries of the Gulf and the Middle East to the COVID crisis, to the need in the future to diversify their own sources and use of energy, with Abu Dhabi now installing nuclear power, but other countries really relying on burning diesel fuel to produce electricity and desalinate water. What is the advice of the World Energy Council, or how have you worked with the governments and the companies in the Middle East looking toward transition to try to find a rational way for them to continue to drive their economies, which are very resource extraction dependent, but also transition their economies to energy that is more sustainable? And then maybe even take that question to the broader world. Where do you see progress in transition, and where do you see parts of the world that are just stuck in the current system and are having trouble move forward?
Well, I'm going to say I see very big signals of ambitious transition in the Middle East region for a start, right? I'm not going to present a case that says one region of the world is leading on everything and other regions are behind. That's not the story. I was last in the region in March. I think there's some phenomenal innovations going on in the region, not just technologically. Technologically, there's the biggest green ammonia production facility being built in the world. But you also have incredible policy innovation going on in the region as well. I've been to visit UAE and Saudi and other governments, and actually what's happening in the region is the region is starting to understand that energy transition isn't just within the energy sector. It's about joining what needs to be done in the industrial development sector, in the transport sector, in the public services sector with energy transition. And you're seeing these incredible moves in the policy innovation space. Then you go to the ministries and visit what does the future energy policy maker look like, or the future energy worker look like, and you start looking at very diverse companies, and you look at very diverse policy organizations. So the face of policy and corporations in the Middle East is much younger than you find in many other parts of the industry and other parts of the world. So I think there's incredible dynamicism going on in the Middle East. The challenge is, will it couple its technology innovation with its financial strength and start to think about itself as a technology exporter of solutions and invest in that innovation ecosystem that's needed for that? Or will it continue to have this disaggregated play across the region? There's plenty of innovation, but actually starting to think about how you pull it all together. What is regional cooperation? How do you actually make that a global play, not just lots of bilateral local plays, will be the story of the region going forward. But plenty of innovation, technologically, plenty of innovation, policy-wise, plenty of innovation. Socially, the question is, which financial muscle does the region really want to use?
We have a question from Michael Moore in our audience on the innovation in the Middle East and the Gulf in particular. And his question is, how strong is the interest in converting oil, gas, coal to hydrogen in the Middle East? And is this a good step toward transition? Well,
I think understanding the scale of the global energy system at the moment, 20% of the global energy system is electrified, 80% isn't. If you look at most scenarios, in terms of best case, people say we might get up to 40 to 50% electrification by the middle of the century. At the same time, we're going to have a doubling of demand for energy, right? So this is the scale of the challenges we're facing. We've heard at the G20 discussions, we've heard about this new approach to circular carbon economy and the 4 Rs of remove, reduce, recycle, and reduce, remove, recycle, and recover, right? I think this is a very viable set of pathways that are emerging. This requires oil and gas players to come to the table and think about alternative ways to decarbonise, but also to produce economic value. And we're in a new era of affordability. So let's be clear, as we look around the world and people are talking about how do we manage the risk of faster stranding of assets, we've always been arguing that infrastructure players need to think not just about new build, not just about maintenance, but also about decommissioning and repurposing as options. And I think when we move into this new economic affordability era, issues of repurposing and the cost of decommissioning are going to have to come further to the foreground in the energy transition discussions. At the moment, you think all we're talking about is the need for new build. That's not the challenge of investment in the energy industry.
Let me talk a little bit more about what you just talked about, is reducing carbon. You said in the past that the energy transition is not a war on carbon, but on carbon emissions. Can you explain what you mean by that and how you can continue to use more traditional sources of energy that have traditionally produced high carbon emissions in a new transitioned energy economy?
Well, I'm always uncomfortable with the language of war anyway, because there's never any winners in war, and I'm always uncomfortable with the language of sport as well, as though it's a race that we're in that's got to be won by somebody. Actually, it's a race that has to be won by everybody. I don't think that's a race. That's not a competition. Not a war on carbon. We're a carbon-based life species, right? The war can't be on carbon. It'd be a war on ourselves. When we talk about energy transition, what we want more energy. We want to be able to use it more flexibly, but we want to do it without destroying the planet. And so what we have to think about is, where's the problem? The problem is, how much carbon can you have in the atmosphere? How do you get it out of the atmosphere? How do you not put it into the atmosphere? And then we also have to have this conversation also about, as we scale up renewables, we make ourselves more vulnerable to the intermittency of renewables, right? That's not an argument against renewables. It just says that we have to find solutions as we take renewables to scale, which aren't just about low carbon supply, but also about the reliability of grids and the storage issues that come with transporting renewables between places you can produce them in bulk and places that you're going to use them, which they're never coincident, really. So there's no silver bullet in energy transition. There are lots of different solutions. The atmosphere doesn't care whether you're stopping carbon going up there or taking it out of the atmosphere. We just need less carbon. There are a myriad of ways of doing that. And my philosophy is, if you want it to be affordable and socially justice, you have to increase the degrees of freedom for societies to reduce the number of degrees of warming. If we keep trying to push very single-minded, single-issue solutions, we will create what I call a goat track for humanity to progress on rather than a motorway. And humanity as a whole needs a motorway of energy to the future, not a goat track.
We have a long but specific question from one of our listeners, Gerardo del Cerro Santa Marisa, who asks specifically about transition in the United Arab Emirates. And generally, what do you see as the keys to energy transition there? You've already commented on that to some extent on the big signals that you see coming from the UAE. But more specifically, how do you understand the linkages between sustainability and competitiveness? In other words, how can the UAE transform and diversify its economy away from oil and gas? And how does it build a sustainable economy that can be supported through this energy transition? Again, this is a very specific example. You may have to generalize on it a bit, but the question of competitiveness and the sustainability of the transitions that countries will have to make in energy.
I think circular carbon economy is a pathway to the future for oil and gas exporting economies that didn't used to be there. It's going to take a lot of investment in innovation to make that happen. We've got to get technologies like carbon capture and storage to scale. We've also got direct carbon capture technologies that could be utilised in that. And then we've got the hydrogen game. And the question is not just about the cost of producing hydrogen, but how do you transport hydrogen? Where do you store it, and who's going to use hydrogen? What I love about the UAE, I go to Dubai, it's got the Museum of the Future, right? In the Museum of the Future, you can go and experience the future. If you want to know what a city today would smell like in 2050 if you didn't change it, they'll give you that experience. What we all know coming through this COVID crisis is that we don't want our cities to smell like that in the future, right? And so they won't smell like that. The COVID crisis gave us a taste of different lands, of different skies, of cleaner water, of what it's like to live in quiet cities that aren't congested, that aren't polluted. We like that experience. So we're going to have to find ways of innovating, and we have to innovate from where we are, not where somebody else has tells us ideally we should be or where we would like to be. We've got to innovate from where we are. And what I see in the Middle East is a huge frisson of innovation starting around technologies. It also has to come around the financing, investment. And for us, we introduced a concept at Congress last year where we said, too many people talk about innovation as though it's plug and play technology. You put in one technology, you take it out, you put in a better technology. We talk about an era of disruption in which we have constellations of disruptors, finance, policy, technology, and society at the table. That's the new game. And if I look into the Middle East and I look at the levers of that disruption, they're all being pulled at once. The question is, what bold vision and how much courage? I think competition is what comes after you change the rules of the game, not what comes before.
I'd like to ask you a question now about, I guess, for lack of a better term, the timeline of transitions. Last year at this conference, we had a presentation by one of the IOCs on their timeline to transitioning to electrification and support of electric cars across the United States and Europe. But a member of the audience essentially asked the question, how do you square the timeline that we've just heard from this large corporation with the much quicker timeline that is advocated by climate change scientists and advocates, where the industry is looking for continued profitability and the scientists and activists are looking for an immediate end to damage to the climate? You, as you look at energy transitions and are advising a number of organizations and countries, how do you square this circle? How do you reconcile these two timelines or find a way, a practical way to mix both profitability for industry and reducing demand, reducing damage to the environment because of climate change?
Well, okay, so we are seeing changes in the structure of the energy industry. We used to talk about IOCs, we used to talk about NOCs, we used to talk about utility companies, electrical utilities, and now we're seeing new actors. We're seeing digital majors starting to pick up the energy services game, right? So the shape of the energy industry is changing. We're seeing what's called integrated energy companies. They're not IOCs, they're not utilities, they're sort of a mix of both. So we're seeing innovation in business models happening, right? Innovation in business models changes profitability, right? What the costs are. So innovation and cooperation are going to change the competitive and the profitability landscape. Now, I have lots of people tell me that we would like to be carbon free tomorrow. I wish I was Tinkerbell and I had a button I could press and we could magically get there. We can't. Our scenarios, IPCC scenarios, everybody else, we look at all those scenarios. We did a big comparison of scenarios a few years back. We look at the assumptions underneath them. Our scenarios that were updated last year say that we might be able to get close to 2 degrees centigrade if we open up all the solution spaces to everything, right? Everything, including carbon capture and storage and direct carbon removal, as well as clean hydrogen, as well as continued electrification, as well as and. Tell us that we might get close to 2 degrees centigrade. We might not overshoot too much. That's still going to require a response from the energy sector also about climate adaptation. I get mostly concerned, not because people want to argue about the time frame between when we will be carbon free. I get very frustrated because nobody's talking about the need for climate adaptation. And we will have to have some degree of climate adaptation. And if we don't start investing in climate adaptation in parallel with carbon mitigation, it will be the most vulnerable in society who suffer again. I'll take the case point of Africa's energy future. In 2050, there will be 1 billion people living in Africa. Already today, we celebrate the fact that we're closing the basic access gap in Africa. But let's get real. The basic access gap, 850 million people worldwide, is nothing compared with the clean cooking gap, 3.5 billion people worldwide, with the livelihoods gap of probably 5 to 6 billion people worldwide. And there is no way that we cannot give those people energy and expect them to stay put. So the question is, we need clean, reliable, and affordable energy solutions. Every country, every region, every company can make a contribution to that. The contributions will be different. There's no one size fits all. All should be welcome.
Let me take our next question. This one is from Dr. Robert Mogilnicki, a resident scholar at AGSIW, and he wants to dig a little deeper on your concept of digitalization. Where do you see the most promising overlaps between government-led digital transformation, some of which we are seeing in the Gulf Arab states, and global energy transition processes? In other words, how is digitalization, particularly in the Gulf, affecting the transition process?
So digitalisation plays across all energy resources and across the entire value chain. So you'll see digitalisation in oil and gas. How do we optimise oil and gas? I think you've got big subsurface engineering digitalisation plays in the Middle East, right? As dramatic as probably as horizontal drilling was a technology innovation at one point, we see digitalisation in oil and gas. We also see digitalisation in electrification, smart meters, blockchain, aggregated, how to use artificial intelligence to service customers better. So digitalisation plays across the board. We see digitalisation in design. So you see digital twin. How do you simulate the operations of a whole refinery or a whole offshore platform by having this sort of digital twin? It's a digital form of a real physical structure. We see digital manufacturing. We see digital maintenance. And we see digital distribution. So there's no one single place where you see digitalisation has the biggest opportunity. I would say there's massive opportunity. The COVID impact has been that the drive to digitalisation is accelerating across all these different frontiers as well. And that raises a new challenge. It raises a new cost. That is called cybersecurity. You can't have a digital economy without a security economy. So the question becomes, will we keep driving digitalisation forward in energy without picking up the costs and the requirements to manage cybersecurity? And this moves us to the geopolitics of clean energy, which are no longer just about oil and gas, but also include data and technology and non-energy resources needed for the materiality of the renewables revolution. So I think digitalisation is a big trend, but it doesn't operate independently of decarbonisation, decentralisation, or this disruption play either.
I'm intrigued by what you had to say about the need for cybersecurity in addition to digitalization of the energy economy. But that also brought up for me, I'm a political scientist who deals with conflicts between nations and societies. How does the World Energy Council see a very conflict-filled world, especially in the aftermath of the COVID pandemic, contributing or making it more difficult to have a good transition into the future? For example, what are the prospects that you see of the major energy producers and or the major energy consumers agreeing on a pathway forward that will make it easier for less developed countries to get affordable energy, for example, when we have just seen over the course of the past 6 or 7 months, Saudi Arabia, Russia, and some companies fighting to try to keep market share for their hydrocarbons and also to keep the prices high enough to maintain their profitability. So how do you see the competition in the system hurting, or how can you get past the competition in the system to help this cooperative transition that you are seeking at the World Energy Council?
So before we went into the current crisis, we laid out 3 long-term energy scenarios to 2040, and they're intuitively named. One's called hard rock, one's called modern jazz, and the other's called unfinished symphony, right? So modern jazz is a highly market innovation world. There's less geopolitics about, but there are other challenges like cybersecurity, right? And data protection. Unfinished symphony is a policy coordination scenario, but there's no single global conductor. And hard rock, as it says, is a world where there's much more introspection by states, there's much more local security, and there's relocalization of manufacturing and supply chains. When we went through the COVID crisis, we started to look at what were the critical uncertainties. We're learning a lot about this virus, but there's still many things we don't know. And we have 3 critical uncertainties for companies and countries that are trying to navigate recovery. They are trust, ambition, and the controllability of the virus. And we've come up with 4 post-COVID crisis scenarios to 2024. Now, our long-term scenario is still in play, but we're trying to work out what happens in the next 2 to 3 years, right? So we have different perspectives on how quickly there'll be a vaccine and how much global cooperation you need on that. We have different perspectives on how much ambition. Is it just about rescue? Is it about recovery? Is it about transformation? And we have different perspectives on what does this mean around trust? Will trust localize? Not love trust in terms of just governments, but this is a whole social crisis. What does it mean between trust between governments and citizens to control a virus? What does it mean not just around the international cooperation for the vaccine to control a virus? And our 4 scenarios are called pause, fast forward, rewind, and re-record. And we're monitoring signals across the world in real time to work out where are these futures in play and which is dominant. The good news is that the global overall, we're seeing the 2 high trust, high cooperation scenarios, re-record and fast forward, gathering the most signals. We're not quite sure if that's because the people contributing to the radar are younger than everybody else and optimistic. So more signals gives a better radar. But when we look at the regional pictures, we see very different stories. And we could spend a whole day looking at those charts and discussing what that means for ambition, cooperation, transformation, recovery, and rescue. But I encourage everybody, check out the radar, add to the signals. Let's get real about where we really are. Let's stop talking about hypotheticals, and we run summits in the World Energy Council where we bring business, government, investors, and civil society together, and we say, this is your menu of choices. How are you going to make your decisions? How do you learn from the interaction of your decisions with other people? I think you call that wargaming, or we wouldn't call it wargaming, but we call it interactive strategizing. How can you learn what the future will be from the interaction of action, rather than the modeling by somebody about projecting the past? So we put it into practice, the future, cooperation, and ambition together.
And how do you, at the World Energy Council, deal with the leadership of IOCs, ministers of energy or oil from countries that participate, people who both want to continue to sell their energy or want to try to develop energy systems in their countries to serve their populations? Do you do this primarily through conferences, or how do you interact with the major actors in the field as you seek a better transition in the future?
I think with a how-to practical energy, world energy community. So we have nearly 100 chapters. They're in different countries. Those chapters comprise a mix of the different energy transition leaders within and beyond the sector: government, business, civil society, digital, auto manufacturers. Increasingly, we say we're trying to reach out to create the energy plus community, because it's not just about energy. And a case in point is last week we ran the World Energy Leaders Summit, where we bring together leaders from different industries, from government, from CEOs, producers, consumers, distributors, and we get them to interact with each other. You know, what are your actions? What are your experiences? Can you share some of that? Then we get them to say, how will you make your choices? What do we learn from the choices you're making? What does that mean for the overall outcome? So we piloted at the last World Energy Leaders Summit this investment interaction around choices for recovery. We're about to take that into the Middle East, I hear, next in the first quarter next year. So if you have people who are in government, whether they're exporter or importer governments, whether they're CEOs of oil and gas or renewables or solar farms, it doesn't matter. Let's put them around the table. They can't optimize their decisions without looking at the choices being made by anybody else. At least they can learn with and from each other. They can still decide how much they want to compete and cooperate, but at least they've had the opportunity to rehearse the future.
We've got about 4 or 5 minutes left in our conversation this morning. I have sort of 2 questions I have. One is looking back at something you said earlier about zero emissions or net zero. this is a goal for many activists, many people on the earth, when we are able to not produce more carbon in the use of energy. How do you define net zero? And how do you think the world can get there if that is something that we should, in fact, be aiming toward?
Okay, net zero. I think to some people, net zero means no fossil. To some people, net zero means no carbon. To some people, net zero means no carbon dioxide emissions or no greenhouse gas emissions above the planetary threshold. I'm definitely the latter, right? There's so much that we have a certain balance of atmosphere, right? Has a certain amount of carbon, nitrogen, oxygen, whatever you want in there, that human life flourishes under that, right? If we change the Earth's life support system, it endangers human life, right? We want to keep that in balance. Who wouldn't? Doesn't matter what sort of company or government you are, you can't live on a planet that doesn't support human life, right? So we all want human life to flourish. So for me, net zero is probably just a way of talking about how do we take the excessive amount of carbon that we're producing cumulatively as in the world out of the atmosphere at the moment? How do we maintain a healthy balance? And we also don't just have to think about carbon, we have to think about phosphorus, we have to think about the water, the hydrological cycle, we have to think about the other planetary boundaries as well. Energy is not a sector, it's the greatest connector. Connects hopes and fears, geographies and peoples. We've got the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. One of those, UN SDG 7, is on energy, but all the others can't be achieved without energy. It is the ultimate connector. You've got to think about how you're connecting industrial development with education, with public services. Energy is the connector there. So for me, net zero is an ambition to say we need more energy and climate neutrality. We need better lives and a healthy planet. There are different ways of getting there, but the general direction is agreed by everybody, that we don't want to develop humanity and kill our planet.
And one final question from the audience. Do you have specific strategies for urban areas? And how do you incorporate the need for shift in energy consumption, especially in an area, not only just energy production, in trying to achieve a good transition?
Yeah, so there's a lot of interest now at the scale of cities, and we would say, energy transition has to involve companies, countries, cities, and communities, right? All Cs, not just countries or companies. And cities are some of the biggest energy users in the world. That doesn't mean to say that they're energy specialists. City planners are not energy specialists, but we're seeing a lot more activity now of the energy industry coming together with city planners and city mayors and city designers and city managers and thinking about what does transition mean for that city. And we have a tool, we have something called the Energy Trilemma Index that currently works at the global level. We're starting to develop that at a national level, and we're also looking at whether those tools can also be developed at the city level. So you need decision at all those levels. And the challenge will be, how do you align urban and national policy frameworks? But let's start off by having tools that allow us at least to work at urban policy scales as well as national policy scales.
So Dr. Wilkinson, we are nearly out of time. Let me give you one final opportunity to pass on whatever messages you would like the audience to take from this conversation and their interaction with you and the World Energy Council.
I think I will go all mushy and say, for me, energy is a gift to humanity. And my biggest concern is the conversations that say energy is bad for humanity. Now, the ways we're using energy and producing energy can always get better. But fundamentally for me, energy is humanity's greatest gift. We're going to need more of it. It's going to have to be climate neutral. It's going to have to be more reliable and affordable. The future of energy is more energy for everyone. Let's work together. Let's find a way of delivering it, and let's make sure that in the way there we have some fun and it's not all dire and doom and gloom.
Dr. Wilkinson, thank you very much for sharing your wisdom, your experience with us today in this discussion. And I want to encourage all of you who have not already done so in our audience to sign up for our closing public session of this year's Petro Diplomacy Conference on the geopolitics of oil and gas and U.S. Gulf relations. The session will take place again on Zoom this coming Thursday morning on the East Coast of the United States at 10 a.m. And you can get more information or sign up for that session on our website, www.agsiw.org. You can also find a lot of other information there unrelated to energy and politics, economics, and the social context within which the Gulf Arab states operate. Again, thank you, Angela, for being with us this morning, to giving us your perspective on the very important transition of energy into the future. And this is Doug Silliman saying thank you very much for participating, everyone. And we hope to see you all this coming Thursday. Have a good day.